We tend to assume that love moves in a single direction. It begins with interest, grows through understanding, deepens with sacrifice, and matures into something stable and enduring. That assumption works reasonably well when dealing with psychologically integrated individuals. But when you encounter narcissistic structures of personality, that assumption becomes dangerously misleading. Because in that terrain, love does not unfold forward, it moves backward. And the most destructive aspect of this reversal is not the chaos you see at the end, but the subtle psychological inversion that happens so early you don't even recognize it as the beginning of the end. People often ask why narcissistic relationships feel so intoxicating at first and so devastating later. And the answer is not that something went wrong midway through. The answer is that the relationship was built on an inversion from the start. What you experienced as love was not the foundation of a bond, it was the performance of a need. And that distinction matters because needs collapse when they are satisfied, while love deepens when it is tested. A narcissistic individual does not enter a relationship primarily to know another person. They enter to stabilize themselves. Their sense of identity is fragile, fragmented, and perpetually under threat. So when they encounter someone who reflects admiration, emotional attunement, or moral clarity, that person is not perceived as separate. They are absorbed psychologically, almost as if they were an external organ performing an internal function. In that moment, affection feels overwhelming because it is not moderated by reality. It is driven by urgency. This is why the early phase feels so intense. You are not being loved for who you are in your complexity. You are being idealized for what you represent, and idealization is not perception. It is projection. The narcissistic psyche takes an internal fantasy of perfection and places it onto you, and then falls in love with that reflection. You mistake this for depth because it feels personal, but it is actually impersonal in a very precise way. You could have been replaced by anyone capable of sustaining the illusion. As time progresses, reality begins to intrude. You express limits, you show fatigue, you disagree, you reveal uncertainty. In a healthy relationship, these moments deepen intimacy because they allow both individuals to be seen as real. But in the narcissistic dynamic, these same moments are interpreted as betrayal. Not because you have done something wrong, but because you have ceased to function as an ideal mirror. This is where love begins to reverse. Instead of growing stronger through truth, it weakens. Instead of deepening through vulnerability, it fractures. The narcissist does not experience this as disappointment alone. They experience it as a threat to psychological survival. And when survival is at stake, moral reasoning collapses. At this stage, empathy begins to erode, not because it was ever deeply present, but because maintaining it requires acknowledging your separateness. Empathy demands that the other person exists independently of your needs. For the narcissistic personality, that recognition produces anxiety, so empathy is withdrawn, gradually replaced by calculation, comparison, and subtle control. You may notice small shifts. Conversations become transactional. Affection becomes conditional. Praise is replaced by criticism that feels oddly destabilizing, as if the ground beneath you is being quietly rearranged. This is not accidental. Devaluation is the mechanism through which the narcissist restores inner equilibrium. If you are diminished, they feel elevated. If you are confused, they feel oriented. What makes this especially damaging is that the narcissist rarely experiences themselves as cruel. They experience themselves as correcting an imbalance. In their internal narrative, you have failed to live up to what you once were. And because that earlier version of you never truly existed as a person, only as an image, the standard is impossible to meet. As intimacy increases, love does not become safer, it becomes more dangerous. The closer you get, the more your humanity interferes with the fantasy. And the narcissistic psyche responds to this interference by emotionally retreating while maintaining surface engagement. This creates the most disorienting phase of all, because the relationship appears intact, but the emotional core has already been withdrawn. This is the stage almost no one notices while it's happening. There is no explosion, no clear rupture, no definitive betrayal. Instead, there is a subtle absence. You speak and feel unheard. You share and feel unseen. You reach and encounter emotional neutrality. And because there is no obvious crime, you assume responsibility. You try harder. You explain more clearly. You offer more of yourself, not realizing that the very act of offering confirms the imbalance. In this inverted structure, love does not die through conflict. It dies through irrelevance. Once the narcissist no longer requires your reflection to maintain their self-image, attachment becomes unnecessary. But rather than confronting this loss directly, the psyche protects itself by rewriting history. The relationship is reframed as disappointing, burdensome, or beneath them. This allows detachment without guilt. What is particularly unsettling is that the narcissist may still say the words of love during this phase. Language remains, but meaning is gone. Love becomes performative, a social gesture rather than an emotional reality. And because humans are wired to trust consistency of words, you remain engaged long after the bond has inverted. Eventually, emotional withdrawal becomes complete, not with anger, but with indifference. And indifference is not the opposite of love, it is the absence of recognition. At that point, you are no longer seen as a source of value or threat. You are simply irrelevant. The narcissist moves forward often quickly because attachment was never rooted in mutual being. It was rooted in function. For the person on the receiving end, the damage is profound, not only because of the loss, but because the entire emotional timeline feels scrambled. You grieve intensely at the end because you were loving forward while the narcissist was already moving backward. By the time you realize what has happened, the relationship has been psychologically over for far longer than you imagined. Understanding this reversal is not about assigning blame. It is about reclaiming reality. Love that begins with illusion cannot mature into truth. Love that depends on self, erasure cannot sustain mutual growth. And when you recognize that what you experienced was not love collapsing, but love moving in reverse from the very beginning, something stabilizing occurs inside you. Because clarity, unlike validation, does not disappear when someone withdraws it. It remains. And once you see the pattern, you stop chasing an ending that already happened long before you notice the silence. The most overlooked stage in a narcissistic relationship is not the explosion, not the betrayal, not even the abrupt discard that people often expect. It is the quiet withdrawal that happens long before anything visibly ends. This is the stage where love does not collapse outwardly but inverts inwardly, where emotional presence is slowly replaced by emotional absence, and where the narcissist preserves their self-image by subtly rewriting the shared history of the relationship. At this point, nothing dramatic seems to have happened. There may be no major argument, no obvious abuse, no single moment you can point to and say, this is where it broke. And that is precisely why this stage is so difficult to recognize. The narcissist does not leave in anger, they leave in spirit first. They remain physically present, conversationally engaged, sometimes even affectionate on the surface, but emotionally unavailable in a way that feels vague and hard to describe. You sense a distance, but you cannot locate its source. What has occurred internally is a shift in valuation. The narcissist no longer experiences you as psychologically necessary. You are no longer required to stabilize their self-image, regulate their emotions, or confirm their sense of superiority. Once that function weakens, attachment begins to dissolve. But because acknowledging this would threaten their self-concept as loyal, loving, or morally consistent, the psyche defends itself by altering the narrative. The relationship is quietly reframed as something that was never quite right, never fully satisfying, never as meaningful as it once appeared. This rewriting happens gradually and almost unconsciously. Moments that were once remembered as intimate are reinterpreted as inconvenient. Acts of care are recast as obligation. Your emotional needs are remembered not as expressions of vulnerability, but as evidence of weakness or excess. By the time the withdrawal becomes obvious to you, the narcissist has already created an internal story in which their emotional disengagement feels justified, even inevitable. What makes this stage especially damaging is that you are still responding in good faith. You assume the distance is temporary, situational, or your responsibility to repair. You increase effort, clarity, patience, and emotional availability, believing that love deepens through commitment. But in this inverted dynamic, your increased presence does not restore connection. It accelerates disengagement. The more you seek mutuality, the more the narcissist experiences you as intrusive or demanding, because intimacy now feels like pressure rather than closeness. The absence of conflict is what confuses you most. You expect relationships to end through confrontation, but here there is none. Instead, there is emotional neutrality. Your words land without resonance. Your pain is acknowledged without concern. You are not attacked, you are simply not met. And because humans are wired to interpret neutrality as safety, you stay longer than you should, hoping the warmth will return. For the narcissist, this stage feels calm. Emotional detachment brings relief. Without the burden of maintaining illusion or reciprocity, they regain a sense of control. Indifference replaces anxiety. And because they have already rewritten the emotional history, they do not experience this withdrawal as loss. They experience it as clarity. Eventually, when the relationship ends or fades completely, you are grieving something the narcissist already abandoned. Your pain feels sudden and overwhelming because you were still investing emotionally while they had already exited internally. This temporal mismatch is what makes recovery so disorienting. You are processing an ending in real time while they are simply acting out a decision made long ago. Recognizing this stage is not about bitterness. It is about reclaiming truth. Love that disappears without conflict did not vanish overnight. It reversed quietly, protected by narratives designed to preserve self-image. Once you understand that, you stop searching for the moment you failed and begin to see the moment the bond was already gone, hidden beneath silence rather than drama.